Hello everyone, and welcome to a History Neeks podcast brought to you by Louis Davies.
James Allen.
And Josh Craze.
Today we're doing the topic, biggest military blunders, and we've got James to start us off.
Alright, because that's what I do every episode at this point. Okay, let's get right into the military blunders. So, I'm just going to start us off Agincourt. Now,
We really like to slag off the French in this podcast.
apologies if you are French. I just went Scottish for a moment. I don't know why. I think you should like that because all the lions and whatnot. But anyways,
The mutual hatred of English people.
Hey, still Scottish. But anyway, so Agincourt. Okay, this is one of the pride of our country, I'll say. When the French thought, oh, we've got superior numbers, let's charge at the English.
And Welsh.
And Welsh. Actually, no, I'm not going to acknowledge it. They charge at the English.
And Welsh. It was Welsh archers.
And moving on.
Moving on. Sorry, I thought you were going to add it to this conversation.
No.
Anyway, so and what is that they greatly underestimated the English longbow skills. The thing is, they thought, oh, let's just charge all of our cavalry and our men through these muddy fields. This is going to go just fine, and it didn't. The English cut them down with their bows. Okay, the mud was a nightmare to get through. Ran into some wooden stakes we set down. Well done.
And when they were stuck, just English soldiers went down, just hacked them to death. Anyone that didn't drown in the mud.
A bit of a misconception about Agincourt is that it's often thought that the arrows penetrated the heavily armoured knights and ended up killing them that way. But even the largest bows of the time, which weren't actually used at Agincourt, weren't capable of penetrating the plate armour. It was more the arrows struck the horses of the cavalry, killing the riders as they were flung off their horses, and the heavily plated knights would actually end up sinking in the mud because of the weight of their armour, and some of them actually drowned in mud. Not the best way to go.
Later this episode, we're going to put Josh in plate armour and see if an arrow can penetrate it.
Yeah, I mean, you got a sword. So
I've got a bow and arrow lying around. I don't have any plate armour, so we'll just have to assume Josh's skin.
You can just cover
is
him in, plates. But I think a common theme with these kind of military blunders that we're going to be discussing is the underestimating of the enemy and being kind of overconfident in your kind of own ability.
Because you've got more infantry.
And
more people.
kind of a big instance of this was the Battle of Caen, I think I'm saying that right, with the Second Punic War, where Hannibal, with a much smaller force, managed to surround the Roman force, which was like almost twice as the size of his, just by tricking them into committing all their forces against his weaker troops, so that allowed his stronger troops to just wrap around and just completely surround the Roman army. And that's just a case of the Romans thinking, we can just defeat Hannibal with just superior forces and superior numbers, whereas you do need battle strategy to win.
Whenever I hear the name Hannibal, I always just think like a riff on the beginning of Hamilton, where it's just like, I am Alexander Hamilton. Instead it is, I am Hannibal the Cannibal.
Yeah.
Moving on.
Yes. So that's obviously a very clear instance where the Romans just thought they could just win a decisive battle, whereas Scipio wanted to, wage a bit more of a prolonged war where they just harassed Hannibal's army, so going at it with superior numbers.
Let's see. Another case of we've got superior numbers being beaten by other tactics they didn't know they can. I'm screwing this up. Let's just move on to Napoleon going up against Russia.
Yes. So 700,000 troops, one winter, 500,000 dead. It didn't quite work.
Made that sound really epic.
Yeah, didn't really quite work. Hugely overextending an army, believing that it would be one very decisive battle, it wasn't. The Russian force simply retreated further into Russia, which there was a lot of, and they just pursued them, and winter came. And on top, the Russian soldiers were also burning all fruit, all crops, and anything that could be used. Meaning that when Napoleon got there, there were no resources for any of the soldiers, and the Russian army had already left. And then they ran into the winter, and most of the soldiers died of cold and were starving.
Because with Napoleon, because part of his strategy was quick warfare, so he relied heavily on living off the kind of land around him instead of relying on slow supply chains. So when it came to Russia, he could only rely on supply chains just because they couldn't live off the land. And I think that's less of a blunder on his part. That's just more Russia exposing a kind of a weakness in Napoleon's strategy.
Yeah, but the weakness in Napoleon's strategy is still blunder.
Yeah, which is
the weakness in Napoleon's
Russia.
strategy was Russia itself.
Yeah, failing to realise that, sure, it's just one big flat plain, but after a while that one big flat plain goes muddy, gets cold, and then you realise there's also nothing on that big flat plain either. So it's just not very good for trying to invade at all.
Yeah, you're just going from deserted town to deserted town to deserted town. It just burning through your resources. They did actually credit to Napoleon. He did eventually take Moscow, which had been sacked, and
it was on fire. It got set on fire, and there was no one there to actually surrender to him.
So he just good. So just like Forrest Gump, he was like, "I think I'll go home now."
And and then obviously we know from history that people don't learn from history. And
so 100 years later, Hitler tried the same thing. With the same kind of strategy, that it was going to be a very fast war, that he was going to win quite quickly and decisively with the blitzkrieg tactics. And then he did the same thing. A lot of his soldiers died. He didn't equip them with winter clothing because he thought it was going to be quite a quick battle and just a few decisive ones. But they did the same thing. They kind of just held certain positions, made a very, very drawn out fight. When winter came, Russians were relatively prepared for it, as they lived there, and the Germans were not.
Yeah.
So he very clearly did not learn from what his predecessor 100 years earlier tried to do.
And he completely underestimated the Russian army.
Yeah. Operation Barbarossa was probably one of the biggest blunders of World War II.
Yeah.
I do have to wonder what was going through Hitler's head when he thought, I'm going to have a quick and decisive victory against the largest land mass on the largest country on the world.
Yeah, and then he just made the war into a war on two fronts. I mean, he was still committed to, although nobody had land, although D-Day hadn't happened yet, he was still committed to the West with Britain, kind of Air Force battles. And he was also on his southern flank in North Africa. There wasn't much point in him just, making the war twice as hard by provoking one of the most powerful nations on earth and having to fight on another front.
What people don't really understand either is that, although they were ideologically opposed, the Soviets and Nazis and the relations between them were actually pretty alright. The Nazis put in demands the Soviets will maintain neutrality if you provide us with resources, and frequently the Soviets delivered on them in full. And additionally, because of Stalin's purges in the late 1930s, they also, the USSR did not want to fight a war because most of their military structure had been killed.
Yes.
It was.
I mean, that's why Hitler had so much success at the start of Operation Barbarossa, because the army was in such disarray. They had no idea what they were doing and would just launch suicidal counterattacks, so it just led to 1,000 men being killed and captured.
But at the same time, naturally, in a country where everyone is equal, you find people, and everyone fighting alongside each other in that way, you find people who are quite good at their job quite quickly, especially when you're throwing thousands of people against the enemy. It was It was a very, very poor decision that could have waited.
Yeah.
I think that a lot of Hitler's military decisions were very poor. The Battle of Britain as well, mass producing fighters and bombers for raiding Britain, when realistically, if that had been diverted to Operation Barbarossa, that would have probably been successful.
Yeah, he thought that when he was close to Moscow, he thought the war was won there. He'd have to focus on Britain, but he failed to capture Moscow, and then for some reason, I know why he wanted to go to Stalingrad, because he wanted the oil there, but he just kept on dividing up his forces. Instead of, whereas a lot of his generals just wanted him to just solely attack Moscow, because if you take Moscow, the capital of the USSR, they might crumble. But Hitler went on, because of his Lebensraum kind of policy, he just went on three army groups on a very wide front, which is very difficult to defend once their kind of attack has slowed down.
Yeah, it was just most of this military strategy was a mess. Especially, now I mentioned the Battle of Britain was also a complete failure, purely because, well, when you've got British radar detecting your planes before your bombers have even gotten to the English Channel, we can sortie fighters pretty quickly and inflict quite horrific casualties on the German planes. Yeah. It was most of Hitler's military strategy was quite a large failure.
Yeah, and then kind of moving on to kind of another separate issue when it comes to military blunders is how incompetent generals fighting a modern war like the war that was last fought a few decades ago.
What you don't find in the Soviet Union, when everyone is equal, then you can actually get some competent people coming out.
Yeah.
But yeah, when you've got, of course, the class system in place, there's going to be these. You're going to get to this point where there's these tea drinking guys sitting in chairs watching back. Okay, these people, these rich people, they're just going to get into these sort of positions, and they're not going to care.
While they send thousands of men to just die. I mean, this was really evident in World War One, where the harsh reality of war, with inventions such as machine guns, modern artillery, barbed wire, as well as just the harshness of the conditions in the trenches, really, it was a clash towards kind of that old idea of war and and kind of glory nationalism, and the men at the top had no idea what the men were going through at the bottom, and because of the class structure and how generally incompetent especially the British generals were, they just sent men to die by just walking over the trenches. And if you're just walking into machine gun fire, no matter how many men you have, it's going to fail.
You're still walking into machine gun fire.
I mean, this is
possible explanation do you have to say that will work? I mean,
the reason why they did it was because they thought that because they were most of the soldiers were being working class men, they thought they would be too undisciplined to, if they all ran across, they would lose control. But I mean, this is most prevalent in the Somme, where there were 60,000 casualties in the first day. And that was because, one, the artillery bombardment didn't work because they used shrapnel shells instead of high explosive shells. Two, the Germans were well entrenched, and they had very little effect because they were hiding in concrete bunkers. And then also, the British soldiers were ordered just to walk across no man's land, which just against heavy machine gun fire.
I feel like you have a better chance against machine gun fire if you were indeed just running across.
Yeah, and then also with World War One is also, if you're still using cavalry charges in World War One against machine guns and the new rifles and artillery, you're incompetent, because obviously horses were representative of the kind of the upper class of the army. And most of the people who would have been riding horses at the time were rich people. But there, the last time there would have been an effective cavalry charge was probably in the Franco-Prussian War. But since then, Crimea, we saw the charge of the Light Brigade, where horses just charged at artillery and were massacred. And in World War One, horses were just becoming obsolete as effective weapons.
Yeah, it's just this case of you're using old Napoleonic tactics in what was considered modern warfare. Like, here's the thing with if you look back, the American Civil War, a lot of tactics changed. Okay, they start a lot at the beginning of that war. Okay, they thought, let's use these Napoleonic tactics, but then
very, very
didn't
single
work.
big armies, a few very big decisive battles, and that decides the entire war. But that very quickly changed, and I think General Grant especially took advantage of the fact that Napoleonic tactics no longer worked. You can't. You need indirect warfare. You need to target supply chains. You need to whittle down really, really big, well-equipped armies. You can't just one decisive battle doesn't always work. But it seems that all that was learned from the American Civil War was immediately forgotten.
Yeah, okay. You have there's this case of there would be this case of tourists would go over and just sit on the side and watch these massive battles play out weirdly, and none of them thought, oh yeah, this is the future of warfare. They just all sat there going, oh, I'm Americans. Look at them killing each other. This is fun.
Yeah, and one of the biggest blunders of the whole Civil War was Pickett's charge, where Robert E. Lee kind of foolishly attacked the Union main line, despite Longstreet wanting him to attack, to redeploy somewhere else. He attacked it. About a third of the men who went up there died, and because of that he lost he probably lost it by the second day, but because of that, his army was demoralised. He lost, a huge amount of men.
About a third of the army.
Yeah, about a third of the army was lost at Gettysburg, which is a huge amount, especially for for the Confederacy, where manpower was not as vast as it was for the Union.
Wasn't there also an error in communication with Gettysburg again?
Yes, so Robert E. Lee ordered General Ewell after day one to capture the hills around Gettysburg if necessary. Now, Ewell interpreted that as saying you don't need to take them, so he didn't. If he had taken those hills while the Union was still fortifying there, the Confederacy probably would have won the battle. But he chose not to. If Robert E. Lee said you need to take those hills, they probably would have won the battle and probably the war.
If he just worded it differently.
Yes.
I think the thing is though, is General especially by this stage he was incredibly overconfident because the myth of invincibility, he was the best general, he couldn't be defeated, etc., etc. And I think there's always that element to certain battles, like battle between the Romans and Hannibal, as you mentioned earlier, the general overconfidence. I think
same with Hitler, I guess. He felt a bit overconfident and went up against Russia.
Because of eugenics and general race theory that he had, that the Germans were just better than the Russians.
Yes.
But I think you also notice it in colonialist battles as well, where the power comes in and thinks, oh, I'm much stronger than them. I think in the first Indochina War between Vietnam and France, they just used columns of men, and they would just get ambushed and torn to pieces by the Vietnamese soldiers. And I think the war ended with a single battle where the French basically got caught, surrounded by artillery and bombarded to pieces.
Yeah, and this kind of trend continued into the Vietnam War with American involvement, where America, because they had superior technology and industry, they thought they can just win the war quickly and prevent the spread of communism. But they quickly realised that it wasn't a conventional war. It was guerrilla war, where they had no idea, no real clue about what the terrain was like. They heavily used bombs and search and destroy tactics, which quickly turned the people against the Americans and South Vietnam. And
they had no idea how to fight in a jungle.
And they were crippled by low morale. There were regular instances where soldiers would frag officers by just throwing grenades into their tent, and also because of the way the army was set up, most of the soldiers in Vietnam would have been new recruits. And imagine being, a 20-year-old being shipped off halfway across the world to Vietnam.
First time he'd probably ever gone abroad to another country.
In a miserable jungle where there's disease, where it's humid, and you're expected
not to mention the ridiculous amounts of booby traps everywhere.
Yeah, and you're expected to fight this foe that
you
was
normally don't see.
And they were much more motivated because the Americans were the invading force, and most of the American soldiers did not care. Probably did not care about the spread of.
I think it's also noted by the high prevalence of drug use and desertion, and also generally as well. Most of the new soldiers going over there had not even received proper firearms training.
Yeah,
they had been rushedly just picked out a hat and told you're going off to war.
Yeah, and it was mostly lower class people and minorities.
Yeah, but he just.
And that kind of clashed with the generals because most of them would have been, a bit more experienced, but they would just hated communism in general. Whereas most soldiers, although they wouldn't have liked communism, they just didn't really see.
It was particularly between the more senior officers and the cherries, as they were termed, the new soldiers.
Those damn commies.
And a lot of the officers would compare kill counts and quite macabre things like that.
Yeah.
But the younger soldiers would be led borderline into ambushes by these people without really knowing what they were meant to be doing.
Mm.
And then obviously, as the Americans didn't know how to fight in the jungle, they then tried to get rid of it with Agent Orange, which
they dropped more bombs at Vietnam than bombs were dropped in World War II.
I'm pretty sure more bombs were dropped in Vietnam than had ever been dropped. Out of anything.
And you can see with other wars, such as the Iberian Peninsula War with Napoleon and Spain, guerrilla warfare kind of goes against everything that most generals would have learned because it's not conventional warfare. It's guerrilla warfare is more about picking up. It's mainly smaller countries going into an occupying or big force.
Does Sun Tzu's The Art of War even have much on guerrilla warfare?
Yeah, and then they would just pick off men or destroy supply lines, infrastructure, just to completely harass the occupying force. And there's not really, if you're Napoleon and you're one of the greatest battle generals, that none of that works in a guerrilla war where you don't actually know who you're really facing.
Yeah, you're just walking around and bam, half your force just got taken out by a random mine someone placed there 50 hours ago.
Especially with Vietnam, it was a particular massacre because you've got generals who don't have very good control over the lower ranks of the army. You've got very poor communication, no real strategy of what you're attempting to achieve, and obviously it's just going to end up being a complete mess.
Yeah.
I think generally most military blunders come from heavily underestimating your enemy, or almost expecting very conventional warfare and then being greeted with something quite different. Like Napoleon in Russia, they didn't bother trying to fight Napoleon's army because they knew they would lose. They instead just retreated and drew them further and further in. In Vietnam, you had guerrilla tactics, and when the Soviets attempted to invade Afghanistan, they met the same fate as well. They were not used to. It doesn't matter how many tanks you have if you never find your enemy.
Yeah, and those Afghans were supplied by the CIA, which turned into the Taliban. So that, in a way, is a massive military blunder.
Yeah, that's all working out just fine right now.
Yeah.
But anyways, I think we've all had enough of that lovely, pleasant imagery. So let's get on to something light-hearted. A lot of people probably don't know about this one. It's called Karánsebes. Okay, I probably said that wrong. Somebody slap me.
No, you're right.
Thank you. But basically, the Austrians were facing off against invading Ottomans, and one night the hussars, or I guess the Austrian scouts, they refused to share schnapps. That's it's a type of shot, and they refused to share it with the members of the infantry. And then a bit of chaos broke out, shots were fired, and then people thought, oh my god, the Ottomans are attacking, quick! And thousands of shots were fired all over the place, and then 1,000 Austrians died that night. And were the Ottomans there? No, they wouldn't arrive there for another couple of days. So then eventually, the Austrians ended up retreating, and the Ottomans took the city without even a fight. Just, congratulations.
Yeah.
You lost the battle because you didn't share your alcohol.
Yeah, that doesn't really follow a pattern. That's just kind of
It's just such a random event in history.
I mean, I think there often are cases where
there's just no explanation.
Where soldiers will just win battles because the troops are so demoralised or so drunk that they just cannot fight.
Yeah. Now thinking about it, wasn't it? Is it in World War One that the Russians didn't get their vodka? Am I getting this wrong? There was a point. There was a time where it's just...
Yeah, there was. I think they imposed heavy tax on stuff like vodka.
Yeah,
in World War One and that.
So much. Some people were tempted to refuse to serve in the army.
Yeah, because you'd have to drink snaps before you went to war for a bit of courage. But
yeah.
Anyway, I think that's the end.
Lesson of the day: never take vodka from a Russian.
Yeah. I think that's the end. If no one else has got any more battles to explain, thank you for listening and watching, and have a good. If you're going back to school, have fun. Go to uni, have fun as well.
And if you're just doing anything else, have fun. Goodbye.